this section, we're actually going to be combining Chapter 4 with a little bit of Chapter 5 because they go together well. The first thing that we're going to look at is an efficiently functioning market, which is going to look very similar to what we did in the last chapter. So we're looking at supply and demand. We already learned that the most efficient point on the graph is at equilibrium. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what that really means. Then we're going to look at two different market failures. One is externalities, and the second is public goods. Before we get into analyzing an efficient market, I want to define market failures. So a market failure is when the market fails to produce the right amount of the product. So don't think of a market failure as a market that has completely failed, that's not working at all. A market failure just means that the market is not working efficiently. Something is happening to push us off of the equilibrium of that most efficient point. We'll see some examples of market failures a little bit later in the chapter. For now, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the supply and demand graph and learn an analysis called benefit analysis that will help us see if the market is working efficiently or not. The first thing that you want to know is about the demand curve. The demand curve actually shows us the willingness to pay of our buyers, and that is specifically equal to their marginal benefit. So the marginal benefit that you receive from a product, that's the highest price that you're willing to pay for that product, and that is what the demand curve will show us. And the supply curve actually shows us the willingness to sell of the sellers, and this is equal to the marginal costs. The book calls this their minimum acceptable price, so the price that they would be willing to sell the product, minimum price where they would be willing to sell the product. First, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the demand. So we're going to learn what's called the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is the difference between what a customer would have been willing to pay for the product and the amount that they actually paid for the product. So this is like measuring the benefit that the buyer receives whenever they purchase a product. Now this formula right here is not in the book. I would suggest writing it down. It'll make it easier to actually do some of the math in here. When we're calculating consumer surplus, and this would be consumer surplus for one individual and one product. I'm going to give you another formula a little bit later if we're calculating the entire market at once, but this is just for one good. You're going to take the maximum amount that buyer would have been willing to pay for the good and subtract the actual price that they did pay. So let me give you an example because this is something that you should be able to relate to. Let's say you go to a clothing store and you find a piece of clothing, maybe a shirt that you want to buy, and it costs $30. That's what the price tag says. And you're right on the fence about it. Oh, I'm not sure. Is it worth $30? Do I really want to spend $30 for the shirt? But you decide you want to go ahead and buy the shirt for $30. That's the most you would have been willing to pay. If it was $31, you would have walked away. So $30 is your maximum willingness to pay. But then you walk up to the cash register and they ring up the shirt and it's actually only $20. Your consumer surplus then would be that $10, the difference between the maximum amount you were willing to pay and the price you actually paid. So consumer surplus is measuring that extra benefit that people get whenever they purchase a product. Now let's look at a little math. The math is very simple when we're just looking at one person or like what we have here, a group of people. So you will be given the price of the product. So the price of this product is $8. And then we have a group of buyers and they're all willing to pay a different amount for that product. So to calculate the consumer surplus, you just take the maximum willingness to pay subtract the actual price that they paid. So Bob here on top, he was willing to pay $13 for this product. It only cost $8, so he has a consumer surplus of $5. So notice we use that formula that I gave you on the last slide when you're just doing one person at a time. Sometimes you have a group of buyers like we do here. You're just going to calculate the consumer surplus for each person, and then you can actually, if you want the market consumer surplus, so the total consumer surplus for all of the buyers, you can just add up all the individuals and see what you get. So if we added up all the consumer surplus here, we would get the market consumer surplus is $15. Most of the time when we're doing consumer surplus, we're going to be calculating it based off of the demand curve. So in this case, if you're given the graph and you need to calculate consumer surplus, you're going to be using this formula right here. This is just the formula for the area of a triangle. And the concept behind using the area of the triangle is actually the same as the little formula that I gave you earlier. So we said that we take the maximum willingness to pay and subtract the actual price. Well, remember that the demand curve is the willingness to pay. So we're looking at the difference between the demand curve and the actual price is the price of the good, which is normally the equilibrium price. We don't have the supply curve here, but it tells us the equilibrium price is 8. So we're looking at the difference or the distance between the demand curve and the equilibrium price, which is right here. And that gives us this area of a triangle. This formula is very helpful when we want to calculate the market consumer surplus without having to calculate each individual buyer one at a time and then add them all up. So notice here we have 40 different people buying this product. If we did it the other way, we would have to calculate each of the 40 people, their individual consumer surplus, and add them all together. Instead, since we have our demand curve, we can just use this formula right here. So we're going to do 1/2 times the base. In this case, the base is this distance right here. So the base is actually always equal to quantity. The distance between this is 0 all the way over to here at 40. So the base is 40, and then we're going to multiply that by the height. And the height is going to be the distance from the top of the demand curve to the price line. So it's this distance right here. So for the height, we need to actually subtract the 20 and the 8, and that tells us that the height of the triangle is 12. So throw that in your calculator. See what you get for the market consumer surplus here. So when you multiply 1/2 times 40 times 12, you'll get 240, and that is in dollars. That's a measure of the benefit that all of the buyers get from purchasing this product. Another thing you want to take note of with consumer surplus is how it changes if the price changes. So if the price fell maybe to $6, and the actual price went further down, we would have a much larger triangle, which means that the consumer surplus would have increased. So if price falls, consumer surplus increases. Also think about how the buyers react to a price decrease. So if price decreases, the buyers are happier, and that's what consumer surplus is measuring. Also remember it can go the other way around as well. So if price increases, then consumer surplus will fall. Now we're going to look at producer surplus, which measures the benefit of the seller. This is very similar to profit, if you want to think about it that way, although we are calculating something different. So the equations aren't the same, but it's the same idea. So producer surplus is the difference between the actual price that the producer receives when they sell the product and the minimum price that they would have accepted. So here's your formula down here that we're about to use. For producer surplus, just take the actual price or the equilibrium price and subtract the minimum acceptable price. Here's an example of producer surplus. Let's say I would be willing to mow your lawn for $20, but you actually paid me $30 to mow your lawn. So I received $30 from you. I would have been willing to mow your lawn for $20, so my producer surplus is $10. So here's an example of the math when we have an individual buyer or a small group of buyers. You just take the actual price, subtract the minimum acceptable price. So for Carlos, got paid $8, would have been willing to sell for $3, so his producer surplus is $5. And we can do that same process for each of the sellers. And then to get the total or the market producer surplus, you can just add up each of the individual producer surpluses. And this, I think, also ends up being $15. Here you can see what producer surplus looks like on the graph. The producer surplus is going to be the difference between the actual price. The actual price is the equilibrium price, which is $8. The difference between the actual price and the seller's willingness to sell, and that is the supply curve. So we're looking at the distance between the price and the supply curve, and that forms this triangle right here. So since we're finding the area of a triangle again, we can actually use the exact same formula we did before. 1/2 times the base. In this case, the base is this distance right here. Again, base is always equal to quantity. So this distance is the distance between 0 and 40. So our base is 40. And then our height. And the height is going to be the distance from here to here. So you do need to find this intersection point of the supply curve. A lot of times it is 0, but it's not always 0. So pay attention to how big this triangle actually is and find the distance. In this case, it's the distance between 8 and 0, so the height will be 8. So take a minute and solve using this area of a triangle formula. Solve for producer surplus. Okay, when you calculate producer surplus, you would have done 1/2 times 40 times 8, and that would have given you $160. That's the measurement of the benefit that the producers receive from selling the product. And you know you want to use this triangle formula whenever you have the graph. This is much easier to find the market producer surplus from the graph than having to calculate it individually for all of the different sellers that we have. Now we'll put it all together. So you can see here we have a graph with both our supply and demand curve and our equilibrium point. If you have supply and demand in your equilibrium point, that's going to give you the actual price of the good. You can draw a straight line across at the equilibrium price, and it's going to divide up your graph into the two triangles that you need. So the top triangle, consumer surplus, is the difference between the demand curve and the price line. So it'll always be the top triangle. And the producer surplus is the difference between the price line here and the supply curve. So the producer surplus will always be the bottom triangle. The next thing that we're going to add here is called total surplus. So total surplus, we're just going to add the benefit of everyone in the market. So we're going to add up the consumer surplus and producer surplus, and you'll get the total surplus at the market. At equilibrium, a few different things are true. First off, Only at the equilibrium point is the total surplus maximized. If we move off too far to the right or too far to the left, so if we're underproducing the good or overproducing the good, the total surplus is actually going to decrease. So right at equilibrium, the total surplus is maximized. At this point, we also have our marginal cost and our marginal benefit equal to each other. So remember I told you the demand curve gives us our marginal benefit and the supply curve gives us the marginal cost. So the only place that they're equal is right at the equilibrium points. This is also true of the maximum willingness to pay and the minimum acceptable price. Those will be equal at the equilibrium points. And the last thing you want to remember, which is actually a review from the last chapter, is that there's only one point on the graph that's efficient. At the equilibrium point, we have both types of efficiency. First of all, productive efficiency, that means we're producing the goods in the least costly way, and we have allocative efficiency, which means we're making the right mix of goods. We're making the correct amount of this product that people actually want to purchase. Now let's take a look at what the graph looks like if we're not at the most efficient point. So when we move away from the equilibrium point, in this case, we're producing here at Q2, we're producing less than we should. That's called underproduction. We have what's called an efficiency loss. The book also uses the term deadweight losses sometimes. These mean exactly the same thing. An efficiency loss or deadweight loss is just the reduction in total surplus because we're overproducing the good. So remember our total surplus was this whole area right here between the demand and the supply curve. If we're producing at Q2 instead of Q1, we're actually chopping off this little triangle that was in our total surplus. So we're losing out on a portion of our total surplus. This triangle right here is the amount of total surplus that we've lost out on. That's what the efficiency loss is, the amount that we've lost out on. The other thing I want you to take note on this graph is that our marginal cost and our marginal benefit are not equal to each other anymore. They're only equal here. But if we're at Q2, the demand curve gives us our marginal benefit. The supply curve gives us our marginal cost. Right now, our marginal benefit is greater than our marginal cost. That means we need to go ahead and produce Q2, and we need to keep producing. So at this point, we need to increase our production of this product. Now let's take a look at overproduction. We should be producing at Q1, but instead we're producing at Q3, which means we're producing more than the equilibrium level. Here we have efficiency losses again. This triangle right here is our efficiency losses. It's hard to visualize the total surplus in this case, but know that when we're overproducing, we're also decreasing the total surplus, and that gives us this efficiency loss right here. What's easier to see from this graph is the discrepancy between the marginal cost and the marginal benefit. So at this point right here, when we're on the supply curve, this is our marginal costs. And if we go down to the demand curve, we get our marginal benefit. When we're overproducing, it means that the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So we should never have produced this much of the good. We're producing too much. We need to cut back or decrease our production until we get to the point where marginal benefit and marginal costs are equal. Now that I've showed you how to calculate everything, here's one for you to try. At the equilibrium price, calculate the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and the total surplus. So you're given the graph right here. You know how to find equilibrium, that's this point. That gives you an equilibrium price of 8. Now, to start this problem, the easiest thing to do is to draw a big fat line right across here at the equilibrium price. That will split your graph up into the two different triangles that you need to calculate consumer and producer surplus. For D, the supply is going to decrease and the market equilibrium price is going to change to $10. What that's going to look like on your graph, and hopefully you have this printed off so you can actually write on it. The supply curve is going to move, it's going to decrease, so it's going to shift directly over, and it's going to cross through this point right here where the price is 10. So just sketch out a new supply curve right here when you're doing D, and draw your line across at the new price of 10, and that will give you the triangle that you need to calculate the new consumer surplus. So pause the video here, and I'll go over this when you're finished. Okay, so I split up the graph here into the two triangles that you need. So you're going to draw the straight line across at the price line of 8, go up to the demand curve, and that will form your triangle for consumer surplus. Now we're going to use our triangle formula, which is 1/2 times the base. And remember the base, that's the flat part right here, and the base is always equal to quantity. So the distance from here to here looks like 40, so 1/2 times 40 times our height is this distance of our triangle here. So it's the difference between 12 and 8. You can subtract the 2 and you get 4. Right? And then just throw this in the calculator. So this will give you $80. That's the total benefits for a consumer. Now we're going to do the same thing with producer surplus. So the producer surplus will be the distance between the price line here and the supply curve here. And since we're finding the area of a triangle, we're going to do the same process. So take 1/2 times our base is the distance between here and here. Again, it's just quantity. So the base is 40 times the height, and the height is the difference between the price and this intersection point right here. So notice our supply didn't hit at 0 this time, so you need to find this distance between 8 and 2. So the height of our triangle right here is 6. All right, and just throw that in the calculator and see what you get. So the producer surplus in this case is $120. Now to calculate total surplus. Remember, total surplus is adding together the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So you're just going to take the $80 and add the 120. And that will give you a total surplus of $200. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to shift the supply curve to our new market equilibrium price. I made the changes here on the graph so you could see it better. So supply decreases and shifts to the left, so I made a new supply curve. I labeled that as S2. It intersects the demand curve right at the new equilibrium price of $10. Here's what it should look like. And then I went ahead and drew in the triangle that you need. So the difference between the price line and the demand curve is your consumer surplus. And we're going to use the same formula for the area of a triangle to calculate consumer surplus here. Okay, so we're going to do 1/2 times the base. Now in our new smaller triangle, the base is the distance between here and here, which is always equal to the quantity, which is now 20. So the base is 20. Multiply by the height, And the height is the distance between here and here. So the distance between 12 and 10 is 2. Okay, and then just throw it out in your calculator and see what you get. So $20 is our new consumer surplus. So if you had a little bit of trouble with the last one here, the main takeaway that you want to know is as the price changed, so the price increased from $8 to $10, what happened to consumer surplus? So our consumer surplus was originally 80 and it changed and decreased down to 20. So if the price increases, consumer surplus will fall. That's your main takeaway from Part D. In this portion of the chapter, we've been able to dig a lot deeper into what an efficient market looks like and how the consumers and producers are affected. In the next portion of the chapter, we're going to start looking at our market failures and specifically and externalities.